So the theme that we chose, we being some of the planners of the evening, people who invited me here, we went back and forth on topics, and the winning topic for tonight is, as you know, equanimity, and the cultivation of equanimity. So I'm going to explore that. I want to leave, about, let's see, I think at least 15 minutes for talking together. So I'll work with the clock, and maybe at a certain point I'll just end abruptly. We'll see. Although I have nice endings and so forth set up. We'll see. And so I think this theme of equanimity is actually a very crucial one for our times. We live in challenging times on all sorts of levels, particularly in relation to some of the larger social, ecological, political concerns. And the quality of equanimity is, I think, really crucial, both to staying balanced personally, but also to being able to act and respond with a certain degree of balance. And I'll say more about the term in several languages, but in the language of the Buddha, the term that we translate as equanimity, the meaning is balance. So it's a quality of staying balanced, essentially no matter what happens, no matter what one's doing, even when things are difficult, even when one is acting in difficult situations, to keep a sense of balance. So it's actually a very, very high aspiration, so to speak, or a very powerful aspiration. In the teachings, the quality of equanimity, in the original language, upekkha, is actually very close to awakening. When one has a lot of equanimity, it's very close to being awakened. And so it's a crucial quality. So what I want to explore some is, first of all, the nature of equanimity, what it looks like in our meditation practice, what it looks like in our lives, in different parts of our lives. I want also to talk about some of the challenges and possible confusions about equanimity. The main possible confusion is that we think equanimity is passive, or it's somehow removed and not responsive or active. That's the main confusion which people often have. Oh, I'm an equanimous meditator. I am aloof. Right? That's a misunderstanding, and I'll explore that in some depth. And then lastly, I want to point to some of the ways that equanimity manifests when it's mature, when there's a mature quality of equanimity. What does it look like? So I thought I'd start with a poem. I once wrote a poem on equanimity. It's been really important for me and kind of exciting. And a wonderful quality. When I was doing the book called The Engaged Spiritual Life, which is out there, I actually I essentially have 2 chapters on equanimity, and I got really, really excited. I had all sorts of discoveries that I'll talk about that were actually not in the traditional teachings, but that sort of filled out the nature of equanimity. Because I was writing that book especially for people who were doing social service or social action, for whom equanimity is quite crucial. And so there were a lot of insights that came from working with that audience, and especially worked with them, as Nina mentioned, in a series of training programs done over about 15 years. So here's a poem that I wrote. Remain in equanimity, says the great teacher Dogo Kensei Rinpoche. Not so easy, though, for the mind to stand still. It jumps around, it shoots arrows, it seeks the strange refuge of reactive movement towards what it wants and away from what it doesn't want. So we train in seeing the jumping, the shooting, the reacting. Mindfulness of jumping does not jump. Mindfulness of shooting does not shoot. Mindfulness of reacting does not react. Isn't that interesting? Equanimity starts with the one moment of awareness and ends with awareness of the one and the many moments. Let me start always again and remain at least for a while in equanimity with the easy and the hard and the in-between. With my body present, equanimity is more than a good idea. With my caring heart not left aside by my would-be equanimity. With my action not left behind, still caught in indifference by my would-be equanimity, still caught clinging to the peace, stillness, or understanding of equanimity. With my response to the suffering of our world not left behind by my would-be equanimity, still caught in complacency or distance or privilege while thinking of equanimity. Balance, yet no one, no part of my life left behind. Balance, yet no one, no part of my life left behind. And there's one of my favorite speeches, really. Some of you know, I think, is also an expression of equanimity. I wanted to read that. This is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Some of you probably remember seeing that talk in Memphis, 1968, the night before he was killed, right, where he spoke. He said, I wanted to read this because I think this is, when you looked at someone like Dr. King's life, you see, I think, quite a mature equanimity. There's a lot of equanimity, balance, but there's also tremendous responsiveness. So this is actually pointing ahead to what what equanimity looks like when it's mature. I got into Memphis, and some began to talk about the threats that were out, what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So, I think a deep expression of equanimity. I'll see if I have time. I'll come back to one other story from his life that is very much about equanimity as well. And then one reading from the Buddha, again, 2,600 years ago. As a solid mass of rock is not stirred by the wind, so a sage is not moved by praise and blame. As a deep lake is clear and undisturbed, so a sage becomes clear upon hearing the Dharma, the teachings. Virtuous people always let go. They don't prattle about pleasures and desires. I don't know what the word in the original language is that was translated as prattle. So we can find something like equanimity in a lot of different traditions, whether religious or non-religious. It's a very deep and respected quality. It really points to this mix, I think, of wisdom and understanding and deep experience to have seen a lot, to seen enough so that one keeps an inner balance that is connected with the kind heart and the capability of acting. Sometimes, I know I and my colleagues, we sometimes talk about equanimity as being like the quality of a wise grandmother who, in relationship to the kids, has seen everything. Nothing is going to knock her around, right? And yet she cares. She's not aloof, but she has seen everything and is there. And there's something that example points to about equanimity. The term in the original language, as I mentioned, I think, is upekkha. It means balanced. We usually see it as balanced. It also means in the original language to look over, essentially meaning to see something without being caught by what we see. To see and still stay balanced, we might say. In the India of the time of the Buddha, that the word upekkha, in a more colloquial way, meant to see with patience. To see with patience. So this is all part of the background. Interestingly, the English word equanimity, which few of us probably have ever used, certainly before we started to meditate, I probably hadn't never used it. It's an interesting word. I looked up the Oxford English Dictionary meaning of it, and when you look at it, it's kind of interesting. You know, it has two roots, and it seems from the Oxford English Dictionary to have started around the year 1600. And the two words are equa, which means equal, or something like even points to a certain evenness. And then there's the word animus, which some of you know is the word for soul. So equanimity is having an even soul, literally in the English word. Interesting, isn't it? Right? And around that time it came to be used of someone, this is in English in the 1600s, of someone who was quote-unquote even-tempered, was equanimous. So it's pointing to something fairly similar. The quality of equanimity as upekkha is mentioned at length in the Buddhist teachings. It's always, when it's mentioned, in a list of qualities. And many of you know that the Buddha liked to teach in an oral culture with lists, right? He would give lists of beautiful qualities. Equanimity is always mentioned last. You know, we have the 7 factors of awakening. The 7 factors like mindfulness and energy and inquiry and concentration and tranquility, which both help us become more awake and are expressions of awakening. Equanimity is the last. In all the list, equanimity is the end. That's why I was mentioning it's a very mature quality. It's also the last of the qualities of the heart. And equanimity, as I'll bring out, is a quality of the heart. The misunderstanding is that it's exclusively cognitive or about, kind of an intellectual approach. That would be a misunderstanding. It's a quality of the heart, of the mature, wise heart. And it's among the different qualities of the heart which are mentioned in a teaching many of you know called the teaching of the divine abodes, or the 4 stations of the heart: loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Equanimity is last. And there are quite a few other lists where it's also last. Equanimity has been, I think, particularly important for me because I think it was a quality that my father had a lot, and there were ways that I really identified that with him, that he actually had a lot of balance and equanimity, although there were a lot of things that were very difficult in his life. He enlisted in World War II when he was 18 years old and was in the service quite a few years. He saw a lot of his friends die. We would sometimes go to veterans gatherings, and that was a part of his life. So he saw a fair amount of death. After he left the service, he got the GI Bill, and eventually he wanted to go to medical school, but at that time there were quotas for people of Jewish ancestry, and my father was not permitted to go to medical school. They had those quotas up till the early 1960s. Some of you know that. so he couldn't go to medical school. He also developed pretty bad psoriasis all over his body when he was in his 30s. And he had, he went blind when he was about less than 50 years old. And he had to cut back on his work. And he thought it was probably, he eventually got a degree in chemistry and was doing some work for the government, and there probably was unsupervised, they weren't using the chemicals properly and they got in his eyes, and that probably caused it. But he did not have bitterness in that way, and so forth. And so he was blind the last 35 years of his life. So it's a lot, way more than I have been presented with, maybe many of you. He also had cancer the last 27 years of his life, and originally was given like a 2 or 3 year prognosis, and he lived 27 years, right? And so there was a lot, and yet there wasn't complaining. There was a kind, I felt like a very deep equanimity. Something there was just not getting knocked around so much. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There were ways that the difficult experiences, I think, maybe shut him down some, of course, but there was a lot of presence, and, there's also something, I don't know if you've known people who are blind, but his heart came much more alive after he was blind. It's interesting. It's very, very interesting. So I thought of equanimity in thinking of him a lot. And I think that, he had that balance despite all those difficult experiences. So the qualities of equanimity, first there is that sense of balance. There is the sense of being able to be non-reactive. I think the core of that balance, we would say, is non-reactivity, meaning we don't react by pushing the hard stuff away, the negative, the unpleasant away, or grabbing hold of the pleasant. So there's a non-reactivity that can simply be with what's there, And some of you know, I think, the teaching, that's one of my favorites, called The Teaching of the Two Arrows. Anyone know that teaching? Yeah. Should I say it? It's my favorite. It's my favorite of all the Buddha's teachings, and I'll give my own interpretation of it. So here it is. The Buddha was basically hanging out one day, and with a bunch of practitioners, and he said, everyone at times experiences the unpleasant. How is a practitioner different from a non-practitioner? Yeah, and they were either stumped or overly polite, and they didn't answer, and so he said, okay, I'll answer it myself, which was a customary teaching strategy. And so he said, everyone at times has unpleasant experiences. Of course, some more than others. Everyone has unpleasant experiences, and we can have difficult physical experiences at times. Obviously, we get ill. We have pain. We stub our toe. We have something happen. Injuries, and of course, eventually there's the dying process. Can be unpleasant. A lot of possible unpleasant physical experiences. Very clearly, we can have all sorts of difficult mental or emotional experiences, difficult thoughts, difficult moods, and so forth. We can have difficult interactions with others, painful, challenging, and so forth. We can be treated unfairly or unjustly. All of us as human beings are vulnerable to those experiences. In that, he said the Buddha, there's no difference between a practitioner and a non-practitioner. How does the practitioner differ from a non-practitioner? He said in this way, having unpleasant experiences is like being shot by an arrow. We're sometimes shot by an arrow. He called that the first arrow. But he said that when we are not aware, not clear, not wise, we will tend, because of the presence of the first arrow, to shoot a second arrow either at ourselves or at others as if that would help. So what are some examples of shooting the second arrow? It's basically going to say the practitioner learns not to shoot the second arrow, and the non-practitioner shoots the second arrow all the time, is reactive. So I can shoot the second arrow on the basis of unpleasant physical experiences when I tense or contract around the physical experiences. Right? And we do that to a large extent. Or we can also, of course, blame ourselves or blame someone else. I stubbed my toe because you left that in my way. I can react and shoot the second arrow at my partner, my son, whatever, and so forth. And we can shoot the second arrow when we have difficult experiences, difficult emotions. That's very common, right? That I have, difficult, or I have a negative job evaluation, and I go into blaming myself, which lasts for 3 months. Maybe connects with something very deep and ancient, and I go into a funk for 3 months. Right? That would be shooting the second arrow, where I blame the evaluator, where I blame my mother. In a therapeutic culture, a convenient target. Right? And so I can shoot the second arrow in that way. I can shoot it at myself. I can shoot it at others. And of course, if I'm treated unfairly or unjustly, I can react against those who I think are oppressive or bad, and so forth. And so the teaching is, can one learn to not shoot the second arrow and be responsive rather than reactive? Doesn't mean to be passive. Doesn't mean to let everything go. But it would mean to respond to a situation rather than react. This is actually, to me, a very simple, succinct, clear way of giving exactly what the teaching is in the Four Noble Truths, which can be actually a little more confusing. The two arrows expresses the core of that in a way that can be, for many people, more clear. And so one other connection I want to make is that I've often thought that the principle of not shooting the second arrow is exactly the same principles we find in advocates of nonviolence like Gandhi and King. We have received oppression, we will respond very strongly, but we will not, as it were, pass on the pain. It's an expression of not shooting a second arrow. So this is a key aspect of equanimity. We learn how not to shoot the second arrow, and essentially we learn how not to shoot the second arrow by watching ourselves over and over again shoot the first arrow, and then shoot the second arrow. In other words, we don't put this in the meditation literature, but essentially a lot of our learning comes from learning how we lose it. Have you noticed? You don't probably put this on the Insight San Diego website, right? Come, learn about your neuroses. Come, learn how you mess up. Because it's actually, there's a nice statement that kind of makes this point a little bit different way. Mark Twain once said that good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. So there's that sense of learning balance by actually having the intention to keep learning and studying when we go out of balance. There's a big part of how we learn, right? A second quality of equanimity is a certain kind of evenness. Whatever happens, there's a certain evenness of temper, like the meaning of the word in early English. That we have a quality of evenness. We can stay with whatever occurs. And one of the nicest expressions of this comes, for me, from a number of Japanese haiku. I think these are equanimity haiku. So I'll give maybe two of them. This is from Basho. Some of you know Basho lived in the 17th century, sort of the master of Japanese haiku, right? And he said, now remember haiku are 17 syllables, so they're short, so now is not a good time for your mind to wander. They're brief. Okay, ready? This is on my interpretation an equanimity haiku. Fleas, lice, the horse pissing near my pillow. That's it. So why is that an equanimity haiku? He's not complaining, right? It's just very matter of fact. Okay, fleas, lice, the horse pissing near my pillow. Okay. Okay. Here's a similar one. This is from Issa, who was a later, the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century. And for some reason, fleas appear in a lot of haikus. So I'm not a close student of Japanese history, but I imagine that the fleas were common. Might be wrong. So this is from Issa. I'm sorry it's so small, but please do practice your jumping, fleas of the house. There's another one. He's going to talk about going to Matsushima, which is I think a beautiful mountain in Japan. Now, you fleas, you shall see Matsushima. Off we go. So I interpret that as evenness, equanimity. So another quality is unshakability. That there's a sense that with equanimity, we keep our center, right? And that this can happen, that can happen, but there's this center that we keep. And one of the ways that this is actually taught and practiced is by working with a teaching some of you know, I'm sure, which is called the teaching of the 8 worldly winds, or the 8 conditions, the 8 worldly conditions. And these are gain and loss, pain or pleasure and pain, having a good reputation or a bad reputation, and praise and blame. Right? And so these are taken to be that which toss us around, which shake us, in other words. In the Tibetan tradition, the metaphor is out of the wind, which blows us around. And so anyone interested in developing equanimity would want to give attention to those 4 sets: gain and loss, pleasure and pain, praise and blame, and fame and disrepute, right? And we're invited to look at how those knock us off center and work with them. So that's a very good way to practice. You can have that intention just to look at those, work with those. So we work to develop that sense of unshakability. I'll tell a story that for me illustrates this. One of my mentors, one of my early mentors was a teacher named Larry Rosenberg. Maybe some of you know Larry. Larry teaches in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he was one of my first mentors. And Larry tells the story. At the time he was practicing Zen, and he was supposed to teach a 5-day Zen retreat in Cambridge. It was supposed to happen right after Christmas. And he was living at the Zen Center. Everyone went home. He was Jewish background, so he didn't go home for Christmas. And he stayed there, but no one signed up for the retreat. And so he went to his Zen teacher, who was the teacher, Korean teacher, Sun Sanim, and he said, I guess we cancel the retreat. And his teacher said, no, I don't think so. And so he said, you're going to teach the retreat. He said, but there's no one there. You're going to teach the retreat? and I want you to do everything that you would do otherwise. So he would do, in Zen they do a lot of bowing, so he did a lot of bowing. He would give the talks. It was a 5-day retreat, and he went through the process, including giving talks every day, as if there were people there, but there were none. And he said that the first day or two, he felt pretty foolish, and he thought his teacher was nuts. But on the 3rd or 4th day, something came to him, and he got it. Something that was behind his teacher was basically saying, essentially, you do what's right, and you stay with that, no matter whether they're people or not people, no matter whether a lot of people are there or no people are there. He said after that, he just didn't have any energy for the kind of conversations that teachers sometimes have. How was the retreat? It was good. How many people came? Oh, there were 100 people. Oh, great retreat. And how many people came? Oh, there were 8. Oh, not so many people. Huh? Right? And so he said those kind of discussions after that experience had no energy for him. There was a kind of unshakability. And he learned that from that teaching. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah. And the qualities also in equanimity of understanding and wisdom, of seeing causes and conditions, seeing maybe there's some difficulty one has with a friend, and maybe equanimity can have something to do with understanding why there are the difficulties. And we're understanding why something's difficult in one's life because of one's own history or background. And that understanding or wisdom can bring some balance, right? I can understand that. The poet Gary Snyder said, it's very helpful to have a 4,000-year perspective on everything. I remember talking with Dr. Ariyaratne from Sri Lanka, and he was the founder of the organization called Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka, which has played a big role in trying to help with the civil war there, and played a huge role with the tsunami about 10 years ago. And he actually developed, in relationship to the Civil War, a 500-year plan, because he said that the problems took 500 years to develop with colonialism and so forth. So having a long perspective is part of that sense of wisdom and understanding. There's also, I think, a sense of faith with equanimity. There's kind of a groundedness, which, as we go deeper in practice, there's a sense that I would say it's like that the nature of our being is good. Or like Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. There's some sense of faith in our being, which is, maybe hard to have now, right, with a lot happening. One insight that I had reflecting on the 2 arrows was that sending messages by Twitter at 3 or 4 in the morning is very commonly shooting the second arrow. Okay, I won't say more. Look at it. So I wanted to mention one other quality and then talk about some of the challenges. I think there's also, and this can take more time to develop, that the quality of equanimity also is very much connected with kindness and the heart and even joy. That there can be this deep quality of joy. And one of the, again, as I mentioned, one of the dangers of equanimity, of working with equanimity, is that we can get overly caught in the cognitive dimension. Again, this is partly due to, a few hundred years or maybe a few thousand years of cultural conditioning which separate the heart from the mind, right? Which is not done in the Asian cultures. In Western cultures that's generally done. And there's a beautiful teaching that teaching of the divine abodes, loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And one of the subtle aspects of that teaching is that each of these qualities, in their maturity, integrate all the other three. And so equanimity, when it's most developed, has the qualities of kindness, the qualities of compassion, the quality of joy. I think I actually found a passage from, this is from an ancient text called a treatise on the paramis, on those perfections or virtues. It says, equanimity, this is from like 2,000 years ago, equanimity is accompanied by compassion and compassion by equanimity. And so that's the teaching. When you practice, it's one of the problems with how we sometimes practice loving kindness is that we don't have that integration with the other three qualities. We practice it on its own. I think it's meant to be taught and practiced with all these getting connected. So I'm kind of getting into what some of the challenges are. Some of you know that there is this very important teaching in the teaching of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, which is that each of these have what are sometimes called near enemies, or we sometimes call them near opposites, or my colleague Heather Sundberg calls them near misses, which are ways that something looks kind of like one of those four qualities, but it's not quite there. And so the near miss of loving kindness is attached love, attached possessive love, and the near enemy of compassion is pity. There's something there that's caring, but it's off in some ways. Traditionally, the near enemy or the near opposite of equanimity is indifference. It can kind of look, oh, I'm equanimous, I'm balanced, but I'm aloof more, or I don't really care. That's the danger. That would be a danger of cultivating equanimity, and that'll be an occupational hazard for many of us, right? And when I was working on that book, The Engaged Spiritual Life, I got really interested because I thought, for my own work and practice and individual work, I thought that I found at least 10 different near enemies. Traditionally, just one. So I've made my contribution to the tradition by identifying a bunch of other ones. I thought, so for example, I think that resignation can look like equanimity, but it's off in some ways. Complacency can look like equanimity, but it's off. I even thought that, something like privilege, one can be very privileged in some way, by, wealthy or, not have to deal with certain kinds of suffering, right? And that can look like, oh, I'm really equanimous, but it's actually some disconnect, right? It's interesting, isn't it? So you could probably come up with a few others. So when we practice, we want to look for those ways that we are off. And some of us are going to be, when we think of the balance between equanimity or the way that equanimity connects with the kind heart in its different expressions, some of us are going to tend to be a little more off towards the indifferent side, and some of us will tend to be more off in, a little bit more on the heart side, so we'll miss some of the wisdom aspects, right? And I think we have to look at how we come out of balance. Another way that I think equanimity is misunderstood, as I mentioned, is that it can be really seen as the same as being passive or not responding. And there's really, again, I think that connection with compassion particularly points to how equanimity, to be mature, has to be responsive. And again, I think we find that in people like Dr. King or Dr. R.A. Ratney, some of the people I mentioned, and that deep equanimity involves action and responsiveness. And it has a few qualities. And I think I'll close by talking about a few qualities of what I take to be mature equanimity. I've already mentioned some of them. There really are these expressions of the balance, the evenness, the unshakability, understanding, faith, joy, joy and kindness. And one way to talk about this is that everything is learning. From the perspective of equanimity, everything is learning. And one engages in an activity and it doesn't work like you wanted to, can you take the perspective of learning something? Dr. Ariyaratne spoke about this as indicating that there is no such thing in his life as failure. He said it like this: when I do something with good intentions and I quote unquote fail, I do not take it as a failure. It may be a failure to others, but to me it is not a failure, because that failure may have taught me equanimity or detachment or renunciation. In learning to accept failure, in a sense, I succeed. Every action that I carry out carries an internal reason which is always beneficial to me. That's from an interview I did with him. There's a sense when equanimity is mature that one has a very, very long-term perspective. Joanna Macy once said that equanimity actually has the perspective of the evolution of the universe from the Big Bang up until many generations from now. That's a good perspective to take. It can give a quality of equanimity. It's also, I think, to kind of recognize that things change in mysterious ways. It's hard to know. Often we lose equanimity because we think it has to happen this way. It has to go like my plan. And so there can be with equanimity an opening to mystery, an opening to the unknown. It can be a quality of being careful. And this is something when I work one-on-one with people, I particularly like to point out one of the manifestations of the second arrow, which is when something difficult has happened and people go into negative narratives, catastrophic thinking. Anyone ever done those? Okay. And I think with more equanimity, one tends not to do that. As there's more equanimity, you say, okay, my minds tend to go to negative scenarios, negative commentaries, but can I open to the unknown? Can I realize that actually I don't really know? Not so easy, right? So equanimity has that quality. And of course, equanimity in its mature form is very good at being with the whole range of difficult experiences. To have equanimity, we need to have our own relationship with fear, with anger, with sadness, with grief, with despair, and to know those, and to, in a way, know that territory. Someone who's mature in equanimity knows those territories from having opened to them. Maybe we don't know some of them, but we know we make use of what we're given. So I think I'll end and we'll have some discussion with just a few expressions of equanimity. This is from the Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi. Things are perfect as they are. They could also use some improvement. It captures a lot. Okay. Another Zen teacher, Robert Aitken Roshi. Anyone met Robert Aitken? Yeah. He was actually a friend. I taught his son. Anyway, he wrote a book called Zen Master Raven. Now, raven is, anytime you hear raven, some those of you who've studied indigenous traditions know Raven is usually a shifty character. And in that book, Al says, what are right views? And this is, I think the answer came from Brown Bear. This is an expression of equanimity. We're in it together, and we don't have much time. So let me just finish with that poem that I read before. I'll finish with the poem I gave at the beginning. Remain in equanimity, says the great teacher Dogo Kensei Rinpoche. Not so easy, though, for the mind to stand still. It jumps around, it shoots arrows, it seeks the strange refuge of reactive movement towards what it wants and away from what it doesn't want. So we train in seeing the jumping, the shooting, the reacting. Mindfulness of jumping does not jump. Mindfulness of shooting does not shoot. Mindfulness of reacting does not react. Isn't that interesting? Equanimity starts with the one moment of awareness and ends with awareness of the one and the many moments. Let me always start again and remain at least a while in equanimity with the easy and hard and in between. With my body present, equanimity is more than a good idea. With my caring heart not left aside by my would-be equanimity. With my action not left behind, still caught in indifference by my would-be equanimity, still caught clinging to the peace, the stillness, the understanding of equanimity. With my response to the suffering of our world not left behind by my would-be equanimity, still caught in complacency or distance or privilege, while thinking of equanimity, balance, yet no part of my life left behind. So thank you for your kind attention, and have a little bit of time for talking together. Any thoughts, reflections, spontaneous poems? Please.
Thank you for your talk, for coming. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So, as far as one thing that you didn't talk about, obviously time is limited, but as far as formal practices for equanimity,
yeah.
I know it's really given short shrift with the 4 Brahma Viharas. You know, you hear a lot about loving kindness, a lot of compassion practices, occasional mudita practices, but very rarely equanimity. And so I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for like a structured formal practice other than the one that you gave of exercising bad judgment.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I've been exposed to one that was actually really rich about, you know, your happiness or unhappiness depends on your karma, not on my well wishes for you or whatever.
Right, there really are 2 contexts for developing equanimity in formal meditation practice, and that would go also to our informal everyday practice. One is in the context of mindfulness and insight practice, and the other is in the context of the Brahma Vihara or the divine abodes. That's what you're referring to. So those are 2 contexts. And so in the first context, a lot of equanimity just develops very naturally by being with what's challenging. That's why it's important in our meditation practice to be willing to be with what's difficult. Certainly when I signed up for meditation, I thought it was the promise of bliss right away, all the time. Right? And so, again, we don't put that in our advertising, do we? You know, come, experience, anger, fear, and learn from it, right? It could, there'll be more honesty in advertising. And so a lot of the equanimity comes from just being with the whole range of experience. And some of it comes from the hard experiences of being, having done a lot of retreats, especially in my first years, I would have a retreat. One retreat would be organized around fear. And generally, I would alternate between difficult experience, difficult retreats, and really opening retreats. But the difficult ones included retreats where I got to explore in-depth fear, another one anger for 10 days, almost unbroken, other times sadness, other times the judgmental mind. And so from hanging out with the difficulties, and this could happen when you just bring mindfulness to a loss, or to a difficult interaction, or difficult relationship, or moment of a relationship, that they're from being patient and being willing to come back and not totally get caught in the reactivity, equanimity develops. Again, another way to practice is when I mentioned we can focus on those 8 worldly winds and really look out for them. And just, bring mindfulness to pleasure and pain. Notice how the mind, body, emotions work. So that's the first area of mindfulness and insight. That's briefly expressed. And then the second, many of you know loving kindness practice, where the usual way of doing it is that we repeat phrases, right? And we repeat phrases silently, internally, like, may you be happy, may you be well, and so forth. May you be free, or whatever it might be. And we use phrases which tend to evoke the quality of loving kindness or compassion. And you're right that in Western centers like Spirit Rock, there's been a very strong emphasis on loving kindness, and not very much teaching on equanimity. And I've actually been more an exception to that, because I've often taught all 4 in retreats. And we teach them some when we teach loving kindness retreats, but not at length. And so for the equanimity, one also works with phrases, much like with metta. And the traditional phrase is the one that you were mentioning. It's something like, one does this in relation to oneself and a whole range of other beings, and you would basically say, and maybe thinking of another person, your happiness depends on your responses to your experience, not so much on my wishes for you. And so it works in balance with the loving kindness. In loving kindness, you say, I wish that you be well. And then you come back with the equanimity and say, basically, no matter what you wish for, kid, things are as they are. Right? And you have to have both. It's like a creative tension, like in creativity, right? There's a creative, for many parts of our lives, there's a creative tension there. It doesn't make total logical sense. So you use phrases like, you are the heir. I think the traditional phrase was, you are the heir to your karma. Your happiness depends on, I forget what the word is, so it's essentially depends on your responses rather than not so much on my wishes for you. And it's key there. And the concept of karma is misunderstood in 100 different ways. So, but essentially, in my interpretation, means that your happiness depends not so much on what's happened in the past. It's not like you made your bed, now you have to lie in it. It's more how you respond. So you could have a difficult past, but the key is how you respond in the present. That's the teaching. And so the phrase that I use is, no matter what I wish for, things are as they are. And I usually, and it's very helpful when you're doing this, I think, to do something like loving kindness or compassion practice first. And then you would repeat the phrase, no matter what I wish for, things are as they are. And you can do it in relationship to in the progression, like you do in loving kindness, to self, and then to a benefactor, a dear friend, a neutral person, a difficult person, and so forth. There's a whole sequence, many of you know. And when I do it, it's typically, I would say, no matter what I wish for, things are as they are. And then, I immediately think of something that either that is as it is and I don't want it, or something that is not as it is and I do want it. And it just comes up and I sit there and go, ugh. And I just keep doing that, and something gets learned in the process. Yeah, thank you. Please, in the back. Let's wait for the mic.
Would you consider Tonglen to be an equanimity practice where you would take in the pain, suffering, and reactivity of other people and give out happiness, love, compassion, and equanimity?
Yeah, Tonglen is a mostly Tibetan practice,
Yes.
which has been popularized a lot by Tamil children in this country. And I personally think of it as essentially a compassion practice, because you're taking in pain and you're bringing some kind of peace or relief. But like I say, that in their mature forms, compassion would involve some degree of equanimity. So I think in mature Tonglen, there's going to be, equanimity is going to develop as you do it more. I actually did Tonglen when my father was dying. And I told him about it, and he was happy. But there was a way that I think in my own experience, there was compassion that also contributed to equanimity. So again, I think as one deepens in all of this, they tend to be integrated. I think it's a very important teaching. Thank you. Okay.
Hi.
Right.
You talked about some of the ways that equanimity is misunderstood.
Yeah.
What about dispassion? How does that factor into equanimity, or is dispassion also a misunderstanding?
Yeah, by dispassion you mean like not having any emotion or passion, something like that?
I do, and I wondered if it relates to those 8 worldly winds. Maybe is dispassion the middle between the two, perhaps?
Yeah. I'm not sure what dispassion is a translation of. I think it's I don't use that word at all personally. And I think it can be very confusing to people. Words like detachment, dispassion can really point to this quality of being non-emotional, which I think is a misunderstanding, certainly from my experience. One sometimes meets people who tend to have that quality, who have done a lot of Buddhist practice. Right? And so I think there are people who tend to be a little bit more serious and not as emotional maybe, but again, I like this teaching in which mature equanimity is integrated with mature kindness, compassion, and joy. That all of those qualities are available. The key is that the dispassion, I think, points to the quality of being non-reactive. I think that's the key. Not shooting this second arrow and having. I think again, passion is a word that is used sometimes in translations in very misleading ways. So but it's an interesting area. I think there may also be cultural differences in that. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, please.
So this year I've been.
Let's use the mic.
Thanks. This year I've been surprised sometimes by the amount of compassion I've had for a public figure who seems to be constantly buffeted by the 8 worldly winds and reacting to it. And so
Is your local mayor?
He's not
It's him too.
But your talk inspired a poem.
Yeah.
A short one, but it doesn't have please. Tweets in the night, I shot the second arrow and pretend the other bleeds.
Pretend that.
The other bleeds.
Yeah. Anyone else before we finish? We're at the time we want to finish up. Anyone have something to add before? Maybe the last one, John.
I would close with not a poem, but a teaching by Longchenpa,
Yeah.
12th century monk, Out of the fertile ground of boundless friendly kindness grows the beautiful bloom of compassion, to be watered by tears of joy under the cool shade of the tree of equanimity.
That's beautiful, yeah. It's a wonderful expression of the way these are all connected. And actually, in Tibetan tradition, when they are practicing these four qualities, one practices equanimity first. Because they want to have the wisdom. They want to have the wisdom from the beginning. So I actually once did a month-long retreat where I did more or less a week at each of the four. And if anyone's interested in that, you can do that at some of our longer retreats. So if you ever do a retreat with me, come to Spirit Rock, and you want to practice these four, because we don't have retreats where you can do that easily. And if you want to just do it on your own, I'd be happy to guide you. If you want to come. Just remind me of our agreement. Okay. And I had 4 weeks to work with this, and I started with equanimity. And that's such a beautiful quotation. Longchenpa was one of the greatest of all Tibetan teachers and writers, and he's quite translated. He was essentially a Dzogchen teacher. But starting with, I think I did 2 days of equanimity, and then more or less 6 or 7 days of the other 3, and then I came back with 5 days of equanimity at the end, and it was a very wonderful exploration, and it was not always easy. Doing sustained compassion practice is not easy, because you're tuning into pain. But it really helped, and like several of you have said, we don't teach equanimity as, we teach it, I think, in the context that I mentioned as the first context, mindfulness, studying non-reactivity and so forth, but we don't teach it so much as a heart practice, as something integrated with kindness and compassion. It's very important. So, anyway, thank you so much. I'll close with a traditional ending, which I like, which is called the dedication of merit, and let's do a very quick version of this, which is to remember that we very much gather and explore equanimity and develop qualities like equanimity for our own benefit, but also very much for the benefit of others. That the horizon of our practice, to use that word, is the benefit of all beings. And we offer the fruits of our evening to each other, to ourselves, but then out also into the world for the benefit of all. Always remembering that when we offer to all beings, we are part of all beings.